Hello, I'm Aaron, and it is a chilly day here in northern Arizona. I'm about to see the Grand Canyon for the first time here in a couple days, so that's exciting. This video is a part 2 / addendum to my first video on amoralism and moral nihilism. It's meant to kind of clean up a little of what I said in that video, as well as expand on abolition and desire specifically. I'm not gonna sit here and claim that I'm very good at making these videos. I gotta double down on my recommendation that you guys check out my writings. They are not perfect, but they are definitely a little more succinct and precise than my videos have been. So bear with me on these. They're intended to be conversational, but in that they're conversational, they also kind of lose a little fidelity, I guess, in what I'm trying to say. So hopefully I'm getting my points across. So I'm gonna kind of start this video with just a little bit more on moral nihilism and on the problems of morality logically. I don't want to belabor the point, but I do think it'd be useful to bring in some actual, like, hard capital P philosophy before we move on to the desire stuff. It kind of helps to know that I'm not just some wild man just, you know, saying shit out of nowhere. This does have philosophical precedent, and I'm not the only guy in the world who is a moral nihilist or has found problems with morality philosophically. So the first thing I want to bring up is sort of the hard problem of morality. It's what philosophers call the is-ought gap. Now, the is-ought gap is essentially that any description of the way things are, of the is, of what things are like, does not necessarily lead to a description of what one ought to do. So for an example, I could say that famine causes suffering to children, but that doesn't necessitate a moral ought towards reducing famine or saving children from famine. Only when we bring in a personal evaluation, really when we bring in a desire, I argue, do we get an imperative. So if I say, I don't like famine, I don't like children suffering, then I can make a recommendation based off of that we stop famines. And in fact, I do make many such recommendations. That's part of the confusion when people say, well, it sounds like you're very moral. No, I have desires that stem from empathy. I have a lot of these desires. A lot of people don't, but many people do. Just because a desire is empathetic, or it's gregarious, or it's social, does not necessarily mean that it is moral in nature. The second piece of actual hard philosophy is called moral error theory, which is essentially the position that whenever people make a moral claim, whenever they assign the good or bad or evil label to something, they're making an error about what morality is. They're behaving and speaking as though there is such a thing out there as morality, as good and evil. They're making a categorical error about the kinds of things that moral statements are or moral objects could be. Philosophers often follow this up with the argument from queerness, which is to say that if moral objects were real, if they really existed in nature, they would be queer objects, they would be strange objects, they would be so weird and they would behave like nothing else we know of. They would not behave like matter or energy. They would be sort of this new bizarre substance, this substance which can arise and vanish in a rhetorical moment, which doesn't have a lot of internal rules or any really, which some people do not see at all or cannot sense. Moral objects would be something that don't really have bearing on our lives the way that physical or energetic objects do. Well, that's all I'll say about our philosophy there. I prefer to keep things conversational. You know, if you want to watch a philosophy video, there are millions of, you know, people who kind of summarize academic philosophy on YouTube. So a lot of people face a similar anxiety when they're looking at atheism as when they're looking at amorality from a personal place. Without God or without morality, what am I to do? What guides my actions? Desirism offers this. Desire. The thing that's already in you which has already guided so much of your actions, will continue to guide them. And it's probably a pretty clean, clear, and efficient way to live to watch your desires, respect them, learn about them, and act in accordance with them. The desirist simply asks themselves, what is it that I want, and how is it that I get it? When we probe our desires, we're really probing beyond ourselves. Because if we're curious, we want to know where our desires come from, how they affect other people, from where do they arise. When we probe our desires, we're probing our biology, we're probing our social situation, we're learning not just about ourselves, but how we were raised, where we come from as animals. So desirism kind of has baked in a very expansive sort of ethic. I think that desires form a much better foundation for social cohesion than morality. As I discussed in my first video and in the essay, morality is truly an engine of conflict. But you might be thinking, well, so is desire, right? Don't people desire war and abuse and the fulfillment of their greed? Yeah. People do often desire these things. In fact, what I propose in organizing our movements along the terms of shared desires is to identify those desires that have emerged on the left and build our utopia of fulfillment from there. You see, a lot of people have some very reasonable beef with the term leftism. You can find Andrewism's video on this. He makes really, really strong arguments for why the term is politically pretty useless. The reason I keep using the term leftism is because I view it as an emergent bundle of desire. While clean binaries don't always exist in history, we do face a time now where there are broad categories of people who want things that are founded on empathy and expansion. And we have a broad group of people who want things which are founded on the satiation of immediate megalomaniacal desire. Now, I think that these desires trace to very common places, and a lot of the conflict comes from a misunderstanding of one's own desires. But nonetheless, when people ask, what about the serial killers? What about the rapists? What about the megalomaniacs? I have to point out that we already live in their society, that our society of elite fulfillment is one which is patriarchal, domineering, nasty, and brutal. I'll bring him up again for the umpteenth time, but Jeffrey Epstein was a desirous individual. This was somebody who wanted a lot of stuff and who used a system which reflected his desires to achieve it. The answer to what about the desires that we find so nasty that are against the big bundle of desires I've identified as this sort of emergent left eros, those are the desires of the mega machine. Those are the desires which control the society that we are forced to live in, and that as anarchists, I believe we should seek to fight. So if I have not convinced you that morality ought to be abolished, I hope that you're at least intrigued enough to follow me into this next section where we're going to talk about moral abolition in a little deeper terms. So let's hone in on what moral abolition actually looks like. It has a personal as well as a political side to it. Personally, it involves, like I said, probing your desires, perhaps even meditating on them. Desirism can offer an ethic that is almost spiritual in some senses. Learning about our desires is learning about ourselves, is learning about society, is learning about the universe. There's also a hard recommendation I offer to the moral abolitionist, and that is to abandon moral language. I try my best, and I'm not always successful, to abandon terms like good, bad, evil, right? But there are also sort of proxy concepts, and I discuss these a little more in my essay. Things like respect, nobility, purity. These are things which often cover for morality or are proxies for moral claims which boil down to good and bad. I find that in my own thinking and in my own speech, I can become clearer and more direct by abandoning moral language. And that also points to something that I've discovered in myself about amorality, which it is sort of a path of clarity. If we can accept that moral objects do not exist, that they are fictive elements, we can see them the way a Buddhist might see the illusion of separation. they are almost spiritually confounding. They get in the way of how we relate to others and how we think about things. And to continue the Buddhism metaphor, it's almost a sort of right speech, right? It is us enacting our beliefs about the universe in the way we talk. Now, I'm not knowledgeable enough, and I won't even try to get into the relationship between language and available kinds of thought. That's a very fraught and deep linguistic conversation that I am not interested in getting into here, and I really don't know enough about. But I do know that it is really hard to make moral arguments and fall back into patterns of moral thinking if you've abandoned moral language. So the personal process of amoralism and desirism, moral nihilism, is to probe one's desires, to look at them harshly, to understand them, and to abandon moral language. But I don't offer moral nihilism and desirism as a path of self-help. Obviously, I am pretty radically anti-humanistic and, in some senses, pretty anti-individualistic. So what I'm offering is not just self-help. It comes necessarily with a political element. Morality is situated in your social and political situation. And we cannot fully abolish morality without abolishing the material conditions which require morality. Capitalism in the state only function with morality. You cannot find capitalism in the state anywhere where it has not created a moral system that legitimizes it. At the same time, we cannot successfully combat capitalism in the state without abandoning morality. This is why I identify morality as sort of number 3 in a big 3 of anarchist abolitions. The first 2 being the historic enemies of capitalism, the state, and the third being the necessary enemy of morality. I said earlier in an earlier video, you cannot use a gun to build a garden. You cannot use morality to build an amoral world. You cannot use capitalism in the state to build a stateless, moneyless, classless society. So if we are to take anarchist prefiguration seriously, we should want to abolish morality, capitalism, and the state together. But also, if we take an analysis of any one of those 3 things seriously, they necessarily implicate the other. You cannot have the state without capitalism, you cannot have the capitalism without the state, and you cannot have either without morality. And that way, I think morality is one of 2 or a few fundamental mistakes that we continue to make in leftist organizing. So we can bring back around my personal recommendations into my organizational, political, revolutionary recommendations. In our organizations, we cannot allow moral reasoning. We cannot allow moral logic, and we cannot allow moral language. That might strike you as sort of grossly authoritarian, the policing of language. Consider that it already exists in pretty much any leftist space, but in any society, period. This is part of the reason why I see freedom as a fundamentally mistaken goal for political movements. All societies evolve rules. All societies emerge rules. The fact that we are revolutionary means we are recreating a society, and so we get to some extent to play with those rules. If we can play with those rules, why not make them work for us? And consider also that there are many restrictions on the way people run anarchist organizations. For example, would you like a fascist to come into your organization and start speaking in fascist tones and language? Probably not. Would you like a Marxist-Leninist or a liberal to enter your organization? No. There's a necessary amount of gatekeeping that we all do, right? So I don't consider it particularly authoritarian to recommend that we abandon and abolish moral language, the same way we would abandon and abolish the state and capitalism. And the other personal recommendation that we can loop back around into a political recommendation is to make space for desire. I don't know exactly what this would look like, but in my hazy utopian imaginings, I picture it as a sort of space where we can have a support circle based on desires, where we can have group discussion, something like a bomb dialogue. That's BOHM, where we can allow a free-flowing conversation of interpersonal exploration. Might sound a little hippie-ish. I am near Sedona. Maybe that's rubbing off on me right now. But those are my recommendations. There is a personal and there's a political element to the practice of amoralism, and I think they're necessarily linked. Another thing that's interesting to bring into this is behaviorism. So the relationship between desire and fulfillment mirrors a lot of classical behavioral conditioning. One of the more interesting and surprisingly utopian thinkers out there was B.F. Skinner. He actually wrote an entire book about his utopian imaginings for a society that was founded on behaviorist principles. So if we are to understand our desires and their fulfillments, we can design societies effectively to meet those fulfillments. But we can also commandeer those fulfillments in a sort of joyful social engineering. And why not, right? If we are comfortable with abandoning freedom, if we are determinists, we should find ourselves, I'd hope, comfortable with embracing things like behaviorism. It also means that we need to make organizing kind of nice. Of course, we can't expect that the war waged against capitalism will feel good all the time. I don't expect that at all. In our hierarchy of desires, we do have to place the abolition of capitalism above most immediate sort of squishy needs. But that doesn't mean we abandon the fulfillments that make organizing joyful and pleasant. We're competing with a society that is easy to use, that is comfortable. Even if it's not necessarily rich in fulfillment, it offers a lot. I can typically have most of my basic needs met. I have to work a lot, but I can also have hours of endless entertainment on my screen, at home. I can have food shipped to me directly. We're competing with a comfort economy here. So I don't think it's very ridiculous to mention that we could turn our movement into a sort of joyful Skinner box. Again, I don't have a ton of really clear, super direct imperatives for how that might work. I only offer it as a sort of heuristic measure to ensure that we are respecting the true behavioral nature of ourselves as animals and of society as an emergent animal system. So, to recap the video, we ought to abolish morality. We ought to abolish capitalism and the state altogether. Amorality, in my opinion, is a political and personal practice of re-identifying ourselves with our desires, and perhaps even identifying a camaraderie of desires. We must recognize morality's political nature, and we must abandon all moral logic, reasoning, and language. I think that a lifestyle of personal clarity, and I think a society of efficacious political clarity, require complete moral abolitionism and a reacquaintanceship with the desire, with our erotic selves. And so I think that's all I had for this one. But it's warming up out here. That's nice. I think I maybe have like 1 or 2 videos more that I want to make. So stick around. We'll talk a little bit about my conception of the mega machine and counter machine in future videos. Again, excuse me, can't recommend enough checking out my writings. They're a lot clearer, and they're sort of, I hope that the videos and the writings are kind of a companion to one another and fill in each other's gaps. But thanks for watching, and I really hope I don't get eaten by a bear tonight. I'm out in the middle of the fucking woods, off some sort of fucking logging road. So if you don't hear from me again, the cougars got me, and not the fun kind.